My son said it in front of everyone, like it was some grand revelation. You just eat but don't help. That's it. For words that cut deeper than any insult I could have imagined. And the worst part? The people around him nodded as if he'd just recited the 10 Commandments. His girlfriend's parents, sophisticated and poised, looked on with polite approval, and my blood boiled. For a moment, I thought I'd speak, defend myself, explain decades of sweat, blood, and sacrifice. But I didn't. I just stared. 10 long seconds where the room seemed to hold its breath. Then I said, "Interesting perspective, son." No arguing, no pleading, just a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than any raised voice could. Tony didn't realize in that moment that I'd already begun orchestrating the next chapter of our lives. A chapter in which he would finally see what true value really meant. I sat back in the kitchen, arms crossed, and let the memory of my life unfold. 45 years, 16-hour days, relentless work to build a life that he now deemed worthless. I remembered standing behind counters in my old North Beach restaurant, Romano's Kitchen, hands blistered and aching, feet sore from endless hours on concrete, serving dishes I perfected with a combination of pride, love, and sheer stubbornness. I fed the neighborhood, trained employees, watched my children grow, and financed every dream my son dared to chase. Every mortgage, every renovation, every dollar he now walked past as if I were invisible. Every ounce of my sweat had been invested in a life he openly dismissed. Tony Romano, or rather Tony Roman, because even his professional identity had been scrubbed clean of the family that made him possible, sat there like a miniature king in his modern throne. BMWs, tailor-made suits, Harvard degrees proudly displayed, a perfectly curated Instagram profile, all funded by my labor. And yet, he had the audacity to tell his girlfriend's parents that I was nothing but dead weight in my own home. I allowed my mind to drift, as it often did in moments like these, to the boy he once was. The boy who would sit on a stool in my kitchen, watching me roll pasta with tiny, flour-covered hands, asking endless questions about life in Naples, laughing at my heavily accented English, and proudly repeating Italian words in his clumsy voice. That boy had vanished somewhere along the path to law school, replaced by a man who seemed determined to erase everything I had built, everything I had taught, everything I had loved. The first signs of his transformation were subtle but telling. The name change. Tony Roman sounded clean, efficient, professional. Easier for clients, he would tell himself. Easier to hide what? His origins? His family? His father? The photo purge came next. Our wedding albums, holiday gatherings, even snapshots from my parents' small restaurant in Naples disappeared, replaced with sterile West Elm frames and minimalist art that screamed sophistication but whispered nothing about legacy. It hurt in ways words cannot describe. Each removed photograph, each carefully chosen IKEA bookshelf, each glass of wine poured for him and his friends without a thank you, felt like a dagger to the heart. But beneath the hurt, a fire began to grow, quiet but consuming. I realized that if I allowed his ignorance and arrogance to dictate my life, I would be complicit in my own erasure. And I wasn't about to do that. I had planned my response long before his words had hit the air. Tony didn't know the phone calls I had made, the accounts I had checked, the meticulous calculations of property value and real estate trends I had run through my mind. He didn't know that every step I took in the next few weeks would be a carefully orchestrated lesson in respect, gratitude, and the consequences of entitlement. In that moment, standing silently in my kitchen, I felt the calm clarity that comes with knowing exactly what needs to be done. I would act, not out of rage, though anger certainly fueled me, not out of spite, though satisfaction would come, but because justice, when measured in sweat, blood, and decades of devotion, must sometimes be enforced with precision. My son had chosen his path. Now it was time for him to see the cost of walking it. I finished my coffee and leaned against the counter. Outside, the sun dipped low over San Francisco, casting golden light across the hardwood floors I had installed myself decades ago. The house was more than a building. It was a testament to sacrifice, a monument to a life built from scratch, a shrine to the small victories of ordinary labor elevated into extraordinary achievement. And soon, very soon, it would become the stage for the most important lesson of Tony's life. But first, I had to wait. Timing, as I've learned over decades of business and life, is everything. I couldn't act impulsively, couldn't rush the unraveling of someone so arrogantly convinced of their superiority. I would let him overreach, let him flaunt his illusions of entitlement and sophistication, and only then would the full weight of reality strike. In the quiet, I allowed myself a small smile. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. I was strategic. I was patient. And I was finally ready to show Tony Roman the meaning of value, the meaning of legacy, and the irreplaceable worth of the man he had deemed disposable. The first move was already in motion. By the time he realized what had happened, everything he had taken for granted, the house, the luxury, the admiration of his peers, would be gone. And in its place would rise the true measure of what matters: family, loyalty, heritage, and respect. Tony thought he had inherited a life of comfort. He was about to inherit a lesson in humility he would never forget. To understand the storm I was about to unleash, you have to understand where it began. Not with Tony's arrogance, not with his girlfriend's condescending remarks, and certainly not with her pristine, polished parents looking down their noses at me. No, it all began decades ago in a tiny, unremarkable neighborhood in Naples, Italy, where my father taught me lessons that would eventually define my life. My father, Giovanni Romano, ran a small pizzeria on the corner of a narrow street. There were no chandeliers, no marble floors, no hint of luxury. Just the smell of fresh dough, tangy tomato sauce, and the laughter of neighbors gathering every evening to share stories and bread. Every morning, we would rise before dawn, knead dough until our hands ached, and prepare the ovens for a day of relentless work. My father didn't just teach me how to roll dough evenly or time the baking perfectly. He taught me discipline, integrity, and the invisible currency of respect earned, not demanded. By the time I was 16, I was managing shifts, handling suppliers, and navigating conflicts between workers. I learned early that trust is fragile, that shortcuts lead to ruin, and that people's true character is revealed not in their words but in their actions. My father's lessons weren't polite. They were brutal in their honesty. One slip, one careless error, and you felt the sting not as punishment but as preparation. Fast forward 20 years, and I found myself in San Francisco with nothing but a suitcase, a dream, and the grit my father instilled in me. I started Romano's Kitchen, a small Italian eatery, with no investors, no safety net, and no connections. Every night, I'd close the doors after the last customer left, count the day's earnings, and pour every penny back into the restaurant. There were nights I slept in the office, waking to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint smell of garlic lingering in the air. I was building more than a business. I was building a life. And as my son was born, I devoted every ounce of energy I had to ensure he had opportunities one could only dream of as a boy in Naples. Tony was different from other children. Even as a toddler, he had a sharp mind, a quick wit, and an uncanny ability to observe the world with a critical eye. I nurtured his talents, encouraged his curiosity, and taught him to respect others, especially those who worked hard to make life better for everyone. But somewhere along the path from childhood innocence to adulthood, something shifted. Ambition became entitlement. Observation became judgment. Gratitude became disdain. The first sign came subtly during his high school years. While his peers were playing video games or complaining about homework, Tony began cataloging what he considered failures in our lives. The old furniture wasn't chic enough, my Italian accent wasn't sophisticated enough, our lifestyle wasn't glamorous enough. He didn't say these things to me directly. Instead, he whispered them to friends, teachers, and eventually mentors who reinforced the idea that he deserved more, that the world owed him more. By the time he graduated from college, Tony had perfected the performance of refinement. A new name, a polished resume, an impeccable wardrobe, and a network of people who nodded approvingly at his every word. But beneath the surface of this meticulous presentation, the roots of arrogance had deepened. He began to view the people who had nurtured him, myself included, not as family, but as props in the stage set of his life. The arrival of his girlfriend, Victoria, marked a turning point. She was everything Tony admired: poised, wealthy, cultured, and impeccably groomed. I tried to be welcoming. I offered to help with wedding plans, gave advice when asked, and made a point of showing respect for her parents. But Victoria's parents had their own expectations. They valued pedigree over effort, money over memory, and appearances over authenticity. The collision of their world with ours was inevitable. Tony, eager to impress, adapted quickly. He performed the role they wanted to see: a successful, sophisticated, self-made man, entirely independent of his family. And in the process, he erased us. Our photographs were removed from his social media. Our history was rewritten. Every dinner, every anecdote, every story I had shared about our family's struggles and triumphs was either ignored or subtly dismissed. I watched, heart aching, as my son became a stranger to me. Not in physical distance, he was right there, but in spirit. He no longer understood the lessons I had lived by. He no longer valued hard work, loyalty, or honesty. He only valued perception. And yet, I refused to despair. Pain can be a powerful teacher, and I realized that the moment had come to transform this pain into action. Victoria's condescending comment at our son's wedding, calling me low class, was not merely rude. It was the culmination of years of disrespect, the crystallization of a worldview that discounted labor, integrity, and sacrifice. The audience laughed politely, oblivious to the history, the struggle, the blood that had paved Tony's path. It was a moment of utter betrayal, but also an opportunity. I began crafting a strategy, one that required patience, cunning, and attention to detail. My goal wasn't revenge in the conventional sense. It wasn't about anger or humiliation. It was about revelation, teaching Tony and Victoria that life built on illusion, performance, and entitlement is fragile, and that true wealth lies in authenticity, loyalty, and respect. Every conversation I would have, every action I would take, every subtle maneuver would be calculated to illuminate their errors without them realizing the depth of my foresight. In this, I was not alone. Memories of my father, of my mentors, of every lesson I had absorbed in Naples and San Francisco guided me. I understood people, patterns, and psychology in ways that Tony and Victoria could not anticipate. And so, with quiet determination, I began my campaign, not out of anger but out of principle. The family they thought they could manipulate and dismiss had far more power, far more history, and far more wisdom than they could ever imagine. This was the stage now set. A family humbled by labor, a son corrupted by entitlement, and outsiders convinced of their superiority. The game had begun. The pieces were in place. And I, having endured decades of struggle and betrayal, was ready to play with the precision of a master, revealing truths in ways that would leave Tony and Victoria stunned, embarrassed, and finally, enlightened. The day of the wedding arrived like a storm cloaked in sunshine. The venue sparkled, crystal chandeliers refracting light onto polished marble floors, gold-trimmed chairs arranged with meticulous precision, and floral arrangements that seemed too perfect to be real. Guests buzzed with anticipation, sipping champagne and trading compliments, their conversations a gentle hum beneath the classical strings playing softly in the background. Everything was flawless, artificial, rehearsed. And there I was, standing at the edge of the grand hall, dressed in my best suit, feeling simultaneously out of place and entirely in control. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I was observing, like a hawk circling over prey, calculating every variable, noting every personality, and anticipating every reaction. Years of experience had taught me that chaos often lurks beneath perfection. I just needed the right moment to let it surface. The first hint of the coming disaster came during the pre-ceremony photos. Victoria, radiant in her designer gown, whispered to one of the photographers, "Can you make sure my father's face isn't too visible in this one?" Her tone wasn't just dismissive. It was a statement, a subtle declaration that my presence was a blemish on her carefully curated world. I smiled politely, nodding as if I hadn't heard, my internal gears spinning. Tony was oblivious. He was too busy fussing over the seating chart, making sure the appetizers were served in the correct order, and checking with his best man about the timing of the speeches. My son, the boy who once learned the value of hard work and humility at my side, had been replaced by someone performing a role written by outsiders. But I let him be. My focus was on the larger stage. The ceremony began with the soft strumming of a harp. Victoria floated down the aisle like a princess from a magazine, her smile flawless, her posture impeccable. Guests rose, cameras clicked, and I felt the tension in the room rise like a pressure cooker. My moment was approaching, came sooner than expected. During the reception, Victoria leaned across the table, her jeweled bracelet catching the light, and in a voice just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, she said, "Honestly, Michael, I never expected you to, be so low class." The words hit me like ice water. A polite murmur rippled through the table. Some guests glanced uncomfortably, unsure if they had heard correctly. My son froze, his hand tightening around his champagne glass. And I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that concealed nothing. There was a pause, a silence so thick it felt almost tangible. And then I spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, but with a calmness that carried the weight of decades. "Low class, you say? That's interesting, coming from a family whose fortune, I hear, was built not on labor or skill, but on appearances and performance." The hall went quiet. Victoria's perfectly maintained expression faltered for the first time, a subtle twitch at the corner of her mouth betraying confusion. I continued, letting my words land deliberately, like stones skipping across water. "Let me tell everyone here a little story. A story about dedication, sacrifice, and integrity. The kind that doesn't come from money, but from years of honest work, from building something with your hands and your heart." Guests leaned in, sensing the gravity of the moment. Tony's eyes darted between us, panic flickering across his face. He mouthed something, but the words didn't reach me. I had the floor and the stage was mine. I spoke of my father, of my humble beginnings in Naples, of the countless nights spent working while others slept, of building a business from scratch, of teaching my son values that couldn't be bought. I painted a vivid picture of our family's journey, highlighting the grit, resilience, and loyalty that had shaped us. Every word was precise, every detail chosen to contrast the artificiality of the world Victoria had brought with her. Then came the turning point. I revealed what I had discovered over the past months. The truth about Victoria's so-called wealthy family. Through careful observation, discreet inquiries, and patience, I had uncovered evidence that her parents were not who they claimed to be. Their wealth, their prestige, their sophistication. It was all a facade, supported by actors, rented estates, and borrowed luxury. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Guests murmured in disbelief, some whispering urgently to one another, trying to process what they were hearing. Victoria's composure shattered, the mask slipping as she clutched her bouquet for support. Tony's face drained of color. The room, so carefully orchestrated, teetered on the edge of chaos. I did not shout, I did not accuse recklessly. I presented facts, evidence, and subtle questions that forced everyone to see the truth. Photos, receipts, inconsistencies in stories. Pieces of a puzzle that, once aligned, left no room for denial. Victoria tried to interject, tried to spin the narrative, but the room had shifted. The guests, once passive observers, now scrutinized her, her parents, and the curated world she had so carefully presented. And in that moment, I realized something profound. This was no longer about humiliation or revenge. It was about clarity, about exposing illusions and inviting my son, and everyone else, to see reality clearly. Tony was stunned, his performance crumbling in real time. He looked at me with something like recognition, the boy I had raised flickering back through the veneer of entitlement. By the time the evening concluded, the wedding had transformed from a glittering performance into a stage of truth. Guests whispered, some applauded quietly, others recoiled, but one thing was certain. The world had shifted, and there was no going back. Victoria and her family were exposed, and Tony's carefully constructed illusions lay in ruins. For me, this confrontation was not an act of cruelty. It was a reclamation of reality, a reminder that integrity, honesty, and hard-earned respect cannot be bought, borrowed, or faked. And as I watched my son finally face the consequences of aligning himself with illusion over substance, I knew the real work, the work of rebuilding, reconnecting, and restoring family, was only just beginning. The aftermath of the confrontation was like a storm that refused to dissipate. What had begun as whispers among the guests became a cascade of reactions. Shock, disbelief, indignation, and, in a few pockets, admiration. The room no longer felt like a wedding hall. It felt like a courtroom, the air thick with judgment, eyes darting, whispers slicing the atmosphere. I stood at the edge, calm, observing, letting events unfold exactly as I had planned. Victoria's facade had crumbled entirely. Her poise, which had seemed impervious mere hours ago, now flickered with desperation. She attempted to regain control, speaking quickly, trying to deny the evidence I had presented, but the proof was overwhelming. Every rented estate, every hired family member, every ostentatious display of wealth, none of it held up under scrutiny. The whispers became louder, a wave of realization washing over the room. Her parents, once towering figures of fabricated prestige, now seemed small, frantic, caught in a web of their own making. My son, Tony, was frozen at the center of it all. The boy I had watched grow into a man of promise now grappled with the dissonance between perception and reality. He had believed in Victoria's world, in the elegance she projected, but the truth had arrived unannounced, merciless, and undeniable. I could see the flicker of understanding in his eyes, the recognition that wealth and appearances are not a measure of character, and that sometimes the greatest deception comes wrapped in beauty and privilege. Guests shifted in their seats, some nodding subtly in my direction, silently acknowledging the courage it took to speak the truth so publicly. Others looked around, uneasy, uncomfortable with the unraveling of a carefully curated spectacle. It was fascinating to watch human behavior, the mixture of relief, embarrassment, and voyeuristic intrigue that comes when illusions collapse. People want drama, but not when it implicates them too closely. Victoria's mother, a woman who had played the role of socialite with painstaking precision, was now visibly shaken. Her carefully rehearsed smiles faltered, replaced by a forced composure that did nothing to mask the panic in her eyes. The father, once the picture of controlled authority, seemed to shrink in stature, as though the very walls of the venue had grown too small to contain his discomfort. I observed, noting every micro-expression, every quiver of the hand, every twitch of the mouth. Then came the questions. Quiet at first, cautious, like a trickle of water testing a dam. Are you sure? How did you find out? What proof do you have? Each question was an opportunity, a chance to solidify the narrative I had constructed. I answered methodically, presenting documents, timelines, and subtle details that left no room for dispute. The evidence was not delivered in anger but in clarity, in precise, deliberate order. It was undeniable because it was factual, and facts are difficult to argue against when the world is watching. Victoria's attempts to manipulate the narrative failed spectacularly. She tried flattery, threats, even tears, but the room no longer responded to performance. People could sense authenticity, and authenticity had aligned with truth. The hired actors, the staged wealth, the borrowed status, all were exposed for what they were. It was a spectacle, yes, but one stripped of illusion, raw and unfiltered. Tony began to speak, haltingly at first, his voice a mix of confusion and awakening. I didn't know, he said, looking from Victoria to her parents and finally settling on me. I thought they were real. I thought everything was real. His words were not excuses, they were acknowledgments, the first step toward reconciling perception with reality. I nodded, my own expression neutral but firm, understanding that this was a pivotal moment in his life. The fallout extended beyond the immediate room. Guests who had been complicit, who had nodded along with the illusion, now found themselves questioning everything. Conversations erupted across tables, private messages were exchanged discreetly, and the carefully constructed social media facade began to crack as subtle photos and videos circulated among attendees. People had seen the truth unfold, and truth, once witnessed, is difficult to ignore. Even after the initial shock, repercussions rippled outward. Vendors who had been part of the grand performance began to whisper among themselves, realizing that some arrangements had been staged purely for appearances. Friends who had been invited for status rather than affection quietly reconsidered their loyalties. It was a lesson in social dynamics, a vivid reminder that authenticity, though sometimes messy and uncomfortable, carries a power that imitation cannot replicate. I observed all of this, my role shifting subtly from avenger to guardian. I had exposed the illusion, yes, but I had also created an opportunity, a chance for my son to see the world clearly, to rebuild relationships based on reality rather than pretense. Victoria and her family would have to live with the consequences of their choices, but Tony had a path forward, one rooted in truth and integrity. As the evening drew to a close, the atmosphere was irrevocably altered. The glittering decorations, the soft music, the carefully orchestrated toasts, all seemed almost surreal against the backdrop of revelation. Guests departed in a quiet hum of conversation, their expressions a mix of admiration, disbelief, and contemplation. Tony stayed close to me, silent for a moment, absorbing the lesson that had unfolded before him. "Dad," he finally said, voice low, "thank you for showing me." I placed a hand on his shoulder, steady, reassuring. "Always," I replied. "Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that teach us the most." The day had begun as a celebration of union, a showcase of wealth and glamour, but it ended as a revelation, a crucible of truth that exposed lies, clarified values, and redefined relationships. And as I left the venue, the cool evening air brushing against my face, I understood one undeniable fact. Reality, no matter how uncomfortable, is always stronger than illusion. The days after the wedding were quieter than I expected, but quieter in this case was not peaceful. The storm of exposure had passed, yet its echoes lingered, vibrating through every conversation, every message, every glance exchanged within our family circle. It was strange to witness the aftermath of a truth so brutally unveiled. For some, it was relief, for others, lingering discomfort. And for my son, Tony, it was a journey from confusion toward clarity, an awakening that could not be rushed or forced. At first, the silence felt heavy. Conversations at home revolved around the events of the wedding but lacked the laughter and joy that typically follow family gatherings. Tony seemed pensive, withdrawn at times, as though processing a world he had just discovered was not as it appeared. I understood completely. I had been in similar situations before, where illusions had masked reality, and the process of untangling truth from performance was slow, meticulous, and sometimes painful. We started small, with conversations that focused not on what Victoria and her family had done, but on how Tony felt, what he needed, and how he envisioned moving forward. I made a conscious effort not to judge or lecture, understanding that emotional rebuilding requires space, not pressure. Tony's voice grew steadier as the days passed, and he began articulating thoughts he had held back. His frustrations, his confusion, and even his lingering guilt for having been deceived. Listening became my primary role, allowing him to lead the narrative of his own healing. Family dinners became our safe zone. We laughed again, tentatively at first, discovering the small joys that had been overshadowed by public drama. We shared stories, not of material wealth or social appearances, but of personal triumphs, lessons learned, and shared memories. It was in these intimate moments that the foundation for rebuilding began. Trust, like a fragile sapling, needed attention and care to grow, and slowly it did. Tony began to confront his own expectations about relationships, love, and authenticity. He realized that being deceived had not made him weak. It had sharpened his awareness, refined his instincts, and clarified his values. Together, we discussed the difference between admiration and validation, between surface-level charm and deep, enduring character. These were hard conversations but necessary ones, moments that would shape his future decisions. The broader social aftermath was another layer entirely. Friends and extended family reached out, offering their support and, in some cases, their apologies for having been complicit or too trusting. Conversations that had once revolved around status and appearance now centered on authenticity, empathy, and mutual respect. It was a subtle but profound shift, a recalibration of values that extended beyond just our immediate family. I also reflected on my own role in all of this. Exposing Victoria and her family had been necessary, yes, but it had been a delicate balance. My approach needed to be measured, precise, and, above all, rooted in truth. The exposure was not about revenge. It was about revealing reality and protecting my family from further harm. In hindsight, it was a moment of clarity, not just for Tony, but for me as well. Sometimes leadership, even within a family, requires action that is decisive, courageous, and morally unambiguous. As the weeks went by, Tony began to rebuild his social and emotional life. He reconnected with friends who valued authenticity over appearances, began setting boundaries, and discovered a newfound sense of self-respect. He started engaging in activities that aligned with his true interests, not those dictated by social pressure. Watching him reclaim his life was a quiet victory, far more satisfying than any public acknowledgement or social approval could ever be. We also established new family rituals, simple but meaningful acts that reinforced trust and togetherness. Weekend hikes, Sunday breakfasts, and late-night conversations became sacred spaces where honesty was encouraged, and pretenses were left at the door. These rituals, though small, carried immense significance. They were the threads weaving our family tapestry back together, stitch by careful stitch. There were moments, of course, when Victoria and her family attempted to reinsert themselves into our lives, sometimes through indirect channels or mutual acquaintances. We approached these situations with calm discernment, ensuring that boundaries were clear and that past lessons were firmly applied. Tony learned the importance of discernment and the courage it takes to say no to people and situations that threaten integrity, even when they come cloaked in charm or persuasion. Perhaps the most profound lesson, however, was about resilience. Life, I realized, is not about avoiding deception or hardship. It's about navigating them with clarity, grace, and unwavering adherence to truth. Tony's journey mirrored this realization. His growth was not linear, and there were setbacks, moments of doubt and anger. But through every challenge, he emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. By the end of the month, the atmosphere in our home had transformed. The tension had eased, replaced by a grounded sense of reality. Tony's laughter returned, genuine and unforced. Conversations became richer, deeper, and more meaningful. And through it all, I recognized that exposure, confrontation, and truth, when handled responsibly, could serve not as destruction, but as a catalyst for rebuilding, not just of relationships, but of character, resilience, and wisdom. In that sense, the aftermath of the wedding was not merely about scandal or revelation. It was about growth, clarity, and the reclamation of authenticity. We had faced deception head-on, endured the emotional turbulence it brought, and emerged stronger and more united. And as I watched Tony embrace his renewed sense of self, I knew that the lessons learned would resonate far beyond a single event, shaping the way we approached life, relationships, and integrity for years to come. After the dust of the wedding scandal settled, I watched Tony navigate a landscape that was entirely unfamiliar to him, one where authenticity mattered more than appearances, and where trust had to be earned, not assumed. It was fascinating to observe this transformation unfold. He had always been intelligent, articulate, and charming, but the exposure had triggered something deeper, a confrontation with reality that demanded reflection, courage, and self-awareness. In the first week, Tony seemed almost hesitant to engage with the world. The shock of discovering that Victoria and her entire family were actors hired to maintain a facade had shaken him to the core. He would sit silently in his room, staring at the ceiling, replaying memories, and questioning his own judgment. How did I not see it? he asked one evening, voice heavy with frustration. I told him that discernment is not innate. It's learned, honed through experience. The key was not guilt but awareness, and he was beginning the journey of awakening. We started with small exercises in self-reflection. I encouraged Tony to journal his thoughts and feelings, to map out what had misled him and what values he truly wanted to prioritize moving forward. He was hesitant at first, resisting the idea that writing could be transformative. But slowly, his pen began to move, and I saw a shift in the tone of his entries. They were raw, honest, and surprisingly insightful for someone so young. Tony was not just recounting events. He was analyzing his reactions, uncovering patterns, and identifying personal boundaries that had previously been blurred by desire for approval. One pivotal moment came during a late-night conversation on the porch. The city lights flickered in the distance, and I asked him a simple question. What do you truly want in your relationships and friendships? Tony paused, considering every angle, before replying with a clarity that surprised me. I want people who see me for who I am, not for what I can give or what image I represent. That statement marked a turning point. He was no longer a passive participant in his own life. He had begun to reclaim agency over his choices and perceptions. Tony's awakening was not limited to relationships. He began questioning other aspects of his life, the academic pressures, the social expectations, and even his personal goals. Where once he had measured success by external validation, he now considered what genuinely fulfilled him. He explored hobbies and interests that he had previously ignored, rediscovering passions in music, photography, and volunteering. It was a beautiful evolution, a shedding of layers built on performance and conformity. I noticed a newfound resilience in him as well. Tony faced challenges differently, no longer reacting with fear or embarrassment when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Instead, he paused, reflected, and then responded thoughtfully. His confidence was not loud or showy. It was grounded in understanding, self-respect, and clarity. He was learning that power does not come from manipulation or social games. It comes from honesty, integrity, and the ability to navigate life with discernment. A significant part of his growth involved mentorship and guidance. I encouraged him to connect with people who had faced similar life lessons, individuals who could offer perspectives beyond the immediate emotional sphere. Tony engaged in conversations with mentors, psychologists, and even community leaders, absorbing wisdom while also questioning it critically. This dynamic exploration allowed him to refine his understanding of trust, boundaries, and personal values. He was not simply imitating advice. He was internalizing lessons and integrating them into his worldview. Socially, Tony began to redefine his circles. He distanced himself from superficial connections that thrived on appearances or opportunism and sought genuine relationships that encouraged mutual growth. This was challenging, as old friendships and acquaintances tested his boundaries, some resenting his newfound discernment. But Tony's confidence in his principles was unwavering. He understood that growth often requires pruning, letting go of what no longer serves, and nurturing what aligns with authenticity. One afternoon, he surprised me by proposing a community project, a mentorship program for young people navigating social pressures and familial expectations. Watching him take initiative, driven not by recognition but by genuine desire to help others, was both humbling and inspiring. Tony's awakening had evolved from personal growth to social impact, demonstrating that the lessons learned from deception and betrayal could be transformed into tools for empowerment. Emotionally, Tony matured in remarkable ways. He expressed vulnerability without shame, acknowledged mistakes without guilt, and celebrated progress without arrogance. This balance was the hallmark of true personal growth, a harmony between self-awareness and humility, resilience and empathy. He was becoming a young man capable of navigating complex social landscapes without losing sight of who he truly was. By the end of this phase, Tony's transformation was tangible. It wasn't just in the way he carried himself or the choices he made. It was in his mindset. He understood the distinction between appearances and reality, between external validation and internal fulfillment. He had learned that life would present illusions, challenges, and manipulations, but the ability to respond with clarity, discernment, and integrity would define his path. Watching Tony evolve from a young man shaken by deception into someone grounded in authenticity was profoundly satisfying. It was a reminder that adversity, when confronted with honesty and courage, can become a catalyst for immense personal growth. He had embraced the lessons of the wedding debacle, transforming them into a blueprint for his life. A life guided by clarity, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The tension had been building for weeks, a subtle hum of anticipation and unresolved emotion that neither of us could ignore. Tony had grown in ways I could scarcely have predicted, more self-aware, more grounded, and yet still carrying the echoes of betrayal that had begun at his wedding. The time had come to face Victoria directly, to bring closure not only for him but for everyone tangled in the charade. I remember the day vividly. The air was crisp, carrying a sharp clarity that mirrored the mental state I wanted Tony to have. I told him, closure isn't about punishment. It's about understanding, accountability, and reclaiming your peace. He nodded, though the flicker of apprehension in his eyes was unmistakable. Victoria and her family had remained elusive, their public facade carefully maintained even as their deception had been exposed. But Tony needed answers, and it was time they were given. We arranged the meeting at a neutral location. A quiet, sunlit cafe far from prying eyes, somewhere we could control the environment without distractions or theatrics. Victoria arrived with her usual composed smile, but there was a subtle tightness in her posture. The actors accompanying her mirrored her expressions with the precision of professionals, but even they couldn't fully mask the discomfort. Tony's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching, yet free from the rage or shame that had clouded him earlier. This was not a moment for theatrics. It was a moment for truth. Victoria spoke first, her tone measured, almost rehearsed. "I assume you want answers," she said, glancing at her entourage briefly before focusing on Tony. I could see him take a slow breath, grounding himself. "I do," he replied simply, his voice calm but firm. The simplicity of the statement, free of anger, free of accusation, shifted the dynamic instantly. It was no longer a confrontation. It was an interrogation conducted with dignity and purpose. The conversation unfolded layer by layer. Victoria explained the reasons behind the deception, not that they justified the betrayal, but that they contextualized it. Money, image, social games, every detail was laid bare. She had expected fear, manipulation, maybe even dramatic breakdowns, but what she faced instead was comprehension and resilience. Tony asked questions without venom, sought understanding without condoning, and demanded accountability without theatrics. Every answer revealed cracks in the narrative she had built for so long. What struck me most was Tony's composure. He didn't need to dominate the conversation or assert moral superiority. He listened actively, reflected internally, and responded with clarity. At one point, Victoria tried to deflect, using charm and evasiveness, but Tony saw through it effortlessly. "I'm not asking you to change the past," he said. "I'm asking you to acknowledge it and accept responsibility for it. That's all closure requires." The simplicity of his words carried the weight of someone who had confronted deception and emerged stronger, someone who had internalized lessons without letting bitterness take root. The dialogue didn't end in dramatic explosions or public humiliation. Instead, it concluded with a quiet acknowledgement. Victoria recognized the impact of her actions, and Tony recognized the reality of her choices. There was no reconciliation, no forced forgiveness, but there was an unspoken understanding that the chapter could close. Tony had claimed his peace not through confrontation or revenge, but through discernment and integrity. After Victoria left, there was a lingering sense of release. The cafe seemed to exhale along with us, the tension dissipating into the sunlight that filtered through the windows. Tony leaned back in his chair, eyes thoughtful. "It feels strange," he admitted. "I thought I'd feel relief, or maybe anger, but it's more like acceptance." That moment encapsulated the essence of closure. Not erasing the past, not pretending it didn't happen, but reclaiming your emotional power and moving forward without lingering chains. We discussed the encounter on the walk back, analyzing what had transpired, and more importantly, what it represented. Closure wasn't about her. It was about Tony reclaiming control over his own narrative. It was about understanding that some battles aren't meant to be fought externally. They're internal victories, measured by resilience, clarity, and self-respect. Tony had faced deception directly, navigated it with integrity, and emerged with a deeper understanding of himself and the world. This confrontation also served as a powerful teaching moment for those around him. I had observed how people often get consumed by revenge fantasies or the desire for public vindication. Yet the most profound victories are silent, internal, and transformative. Tony's handling of Victoria exemplified this principle. His growth, composure, and clarity were far more compelling than any dramatic exposure could have been. By the end of the day, Tony had reached a level of maturity few achieve without years of experience. He had seen deception, manipulation, and betrayal firsthand, and yet he responded not with vengeance but with wisdom. The chapter with Victoria and her family was now complete, sealed not with spectacle but with discernment, courage, and personal integrity. As we walked away, the city around us seemed brighter, almost symbolic of the clarity Tony had achieved. There was no animosity, no lingering bitterness, only the quiet strength of someone who had faced falsehood, navigated it with honesty, and stepped into a future unburdened by the illusions of others. This was closure in its purest form, a resolution that honored truth, personal growth, and the power of integrity over deceit. The days after the confrontation with Victoria carried a different rhythm. There was no grand announcement, no public fanfare, just the quiet, steady unfolding of life as Tony stepped into a new chapter. What struck me most was how subtly powerful this transition was. Change didn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes, it arrived as a calm certainty, a sense of clarity that reshaped every choice and action. Tony's demeanor had shifted noticeably. Gone was the tension that had shadowed him through the wedding debacle and the exposure of the deceitful family. In its place was a calm assertiveness, the kind that comes from confronting falsehood, standing tall and reclaiming your narrative. He walked with purpose, spoke with clarity, and made decisions with a focus that suggested he was no longer tethered by the illusions or expectations of others. Watching him, I realized the most profound transformations are internal. They may not be broadcasted to the world, but their effects ripple outward in everything you do. The first step toward moving forward was rebuilding trust, not in others immediately, but in himself. Tony had learned that deception and manipulation could shake confidence, but they didn't have to define him. He started small, reconnecting with friends he had distanced himself from, investing time in personal hobbies that had been neglected, and prioritizing emotional wellness. Each small choice was a reinforcement of his own autonomy, a declaration that his life would be governed by his values, not by the dishonesty or expectations of others. Financial and professional stability also played a role. The wedding fiasco had been a stark reminder that appearances often mask reality, but it also reinforced the importance of transparency and authenticity in every venture. Tony approached his business endeavors with renewed vigor, applying lessons learned about vigilance, integrity, and due diligence. He recognized that trust could be both fragile and invaluable, and he treated it with the care it deserved, selective, deliberate, and principled. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Tony was no longer reactive. He was proactive, strategic, and centered. Socially, there was a new energy around him. People were drawn to his authenticity, to the quiet confidence that radiated from someone who had faced deception, processed it, and emerged stronger. He didn't seek approval, and he didn't need validation. His interactions were genuine because they were grounded in self-assurance rather than ego or fear. This subtle magnetism changed the dynamics of friendships and relationships, drawing in those who resonated with integrity and repelling superficiality. Tony's social environment began to reflect his inner growth. Family dynamics, too, underwent a transformation. There was a newfound openness and communication that had been absent before. Tony approached conversations with patience, empathy, and clarity, applying the lessons he had learned from confrontation and closure. Discussions that might have escalated in the past were now handled with calm, intentional dialogue. Boundaries were respected, expectations were clear, and mutual understanding was prioritized. The ripple effects of his personal growth extended far beyond himself, reshaping relationships in meaningful ways. Spiritually and emotionally, Tony had achieved a level of resilience that few experience without considerable hardship. The trials of the wedding and the exposure of deception had tested him, yet they also became catalysts for profound personal development. He practiced mindfulness, journaling, and self-reflection, allowing himself to process emotions fully without being trapped by them. Gratitude became a daily practice, gratitude for clarity, for lessons learned, and for the ability to navigate life with integrity. It was a quiet power, the kind that doesn't demand recognition but shapes every action and decision. The most symbolic step of all was Tony's willingness to embrace new beginnings, romantically, socially, and professionally. He didn't rush into anything, but he allowed himself to envision possibilities beyond the shadow of the past. He met new people, explored fresh experiences, and pursued opportunities that aligned with his renewed values. Each step forward was measured, intentional, and free from the burden of past deception. In essence, Tony had reclaimed not just his life, but his ability to shape it on his own terms. Ultimately, the story of betrayal, confrontation, and closure culminated in something larger than drama or revenge. It became a testament to resilience, integrity, and the transformative power of facing adversity head-on. Tony's journey was proof that even the most humiliating or painful experiences could serve as catalysts for profound growth. He had learned that true victory is not in public spectacle, but in internal fortitude, clarity, and the courage to move forward with purpose and authenticity. As we watched the sunset one evening, Tony reflected on the journey with a calm smile. "It's strange," he said. "I thought the wedding would define me, but it turned out to teach me. I lost nothing that mattered. I gained everything that does." And in that moment, it was clear. Tony's new beginnings were not just a continuation of life. They were a rebirth. The shadows of deception, drama, and betrayal had lifted, leaving behind only the clarity of self-respect, wisdom, and the quiet strength to face whatever came next. The future was no longer uncertain or frightening. It was a canvas, blank yet promising, waiting for choices made with integrity, courage, and authenticity. And for Tony, for everyone who had witnessed the journey, it was a reminder that life's most challenging moments often carry the seeds of the most profound growth. Moving forward wasn't just about leaving the past behind. It was about stepping into the life you were always meant to create.